today, of course, we are very privileged to have Melissa Bilal, who is currently a Doumanian professor in NELC at the University of Chicago. She previously was a visiting scholar in MIT, a visiting scholar in history, and then Orjanyan visiting faculty of Armenian studies before that, actually, in Messas at Columbia University. She also has been a visiting lecturer of history at Boğaziçi University and postdoctoral research fellow at Orient Institute in Istanbul. Receiving her BA and MA in sociology at Boğaziçi University, and afterwards she got PhD in music at the University of Chicago. So this is her, coming home back. She held a 2-year Mellon postdoctoral teaching fellowship in music at Columbia University. Her research and publication areas include politics of remembrance in Turkey and the critique of neoliberal memory politics in relation of the 1915-1922 genocide, stories of violence, displacement, disposition, and survival, effective formation and transmission of historical knowledge within the Armenian community in Turkey, singing and storytelling as testimonial and protest practices, history and politics of music ethnography, history of Armenian feminism. She has recently completed voice signatures, recordings of Russian Armenian POWs in German camps, 1916 and 1918. On the Berlin Staatliche Museum, Preußische Kulturbesitz, forthcoming in 2018. That's my German. A CD project that works through the colonialist and racist past of musicological research. She's currently working on her monograph, tentatively titled The Wake Up Lullaby, Gender and the Song of the Armenian Revolution, which is a study of the turn of the 20th century Armenian discourses on music, memory, and homeland. Together with Lerna Ekmekçoğlu, Melissa co-edited in 2006, volume A Cry for Justice, 5 Armenian feminist writers from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, from 1862 to 1933. This is in Turkish and is now, Melissa is now collaborating on feminism in Armenian, an interpretive anthology and digital archive, a book and digital humanities project focusing on 12 Armenian feminist writers who were active in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman contexts and their diasporas. And today she will be presenting a very interesting topic with the title Never Bow in Servitude, Ottoman Armenian Women's Writings on Anti-Militarism and People's Right to Self-Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Melissa Bilal.
Thank you, Ripsime. So let me begin by thanking you for coming, and to Franklin Lewis, Holly Schisler, Ripsime Harutyunyan, Orit Bashkin, Amanda Young, Amina Dresin of NELC for inviting me, for hosting me, and for taking care of the administrative work and logistics. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Doumanian family for providing funding for this Armenian Studies chair, without which I wouldn't be able to teach this class at the University of Chicago. Many thanks also to all the old and new friends, colleagues, professors in NELC, in the Department of Music, where I graduated from, and in the other departments who made my visit this term at the University of Chicago feel like a true homecoming. And thank you, Noah, for being part of that. This term I was invited to present in the Armenian Turkish Circus and Ethnomusicology workshop, and I thank their organizers as well for reaching out and giving me the chance to share my work with the U of C community. So today I will be talking about Ottoman Armenian, or rather Armenian Ottoman, women's writings on war, peace, anti-militarism, and resistance. And my talk will specifically focus on the writings of two women, namely Mari Beyleryan and Zabel Yesayan. I will devote the first part of this lecture to the larger project this paper is part of. The project is Feminism in Armenian. Yes, Feminism in Armenian, an interpretive anthology and digital archive. It is a collaborative work with my colleague Lerna Ekmekçioğlu at MIT, as Sırpsime said. It has two components, a book, an interpretive anthology of Armenian feminist writings, and a website, a digital archive of the history of Armenian feminism. The time period it covers is from mid-1860s to mid-1960s. Who are these feminists? Our work features 12 Armenian women, writers and activists, all born as Ottoman subjects and lived in the Ottoman capital, except for one who was born in Bursa, 150 kilometers from Istanbul. All were born in Constantinople, Ottoman Constantinople. They died in different places, including Republican Istanbul, New York, Washington, D.C., Beirut, Paris, and the Soviet Union. So let's see who they are. 12 of them, Yelvis Kesaratyan, Sırpu Hidusap, Zabel Asadur, Anais Yevpime Avedisyan, Zarui Kalemkeryan, Arşagui Teotik, Mari Beyleryan, Zabel Yesayan, Zaruhi Bahri, Haygan Uşmark, Bartui Kalantar Nalbantyan, and Siran Seza. These women wrote poems, novels, novellas. Sorry, am I moving too much? Sorry. These women wrote poems, novels, novellas, short stories, memoirs, plays, essays, political commentaries, reports, textbooks. They translated many important texts into Armenian. They delivered public speeches with significant political consequences. They established and chaired women's organizations, opened and directed schools and orphanages, worked as teachers and principals, published women's journals, co-edited literary periodicals, edited women's sections in major papers of their time, took active part in Armenian political parties and the revolutionary movement, led protests. They were arrested, jailed, and killed. They fell victim to the genocide or survived it and devoted themselves to document and bring it to international visibility. They actively worked to rebuild the post-genocide Armenian communities in different parts of the world. So our book, Feminism in Armenian, an interpretive anthology, documents and theorizes the beginnings and development of Armenian feminism through a genealogy of Armenian women writers in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman Istanbul and its diaspora. The book presents selections of original writings by these women, all preambled and annotated by me and Lerna. Every section devoted to a woman opens with an article we wrote on the life, work, thoughts, and activism of this specific woman. And this is our translation team. The Feminism in Armenian project draws on and extends the research we have been conducting since we were college students in Istanbul at Boğaziçi University. Two things inspired us to put this project together. First, the necessity we felt for an English language source book that anthologizes the writings of early Armenian feminists. We both have been teaching gender and history related courses at different universities and trying to incorporate Armenian women's writings into our course material as much as possible. But until this project, very few of their works were translated into English. In fact, my class here at the University of Chicago this term, and my students are here, thanks for coming, is the first class in history to use a rich collection of original writings by Armenian feminists in their English translation. For that matter, many of these works that we include in our book, even the authors themselves we include in the book, were almost buried in history. They remain invisible in Armenian intellectual history as well. The second big motivation behind this project was the paradigm-shifting impact our edited volume in Turkish Bir Adalet Feryadı, had on the historiography of feminism in the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey. This book in Turkish focused on 5 of these women that we are studying right now, presented a selection of their works in English in Turkish translation, along with analytical articles on the lives and works of these women by scholars such as Victoria Rowe and Hasmik Halapyan, whose works on the history of Armenian feminism have been and still are important sources, and we are reading their work in our class. We have been reading in my class this term. Today in Turkey, Bir Adalet Feryadı, A Cry for Justice, is used as a textbook at the universities and as a source book in many activist events and publications. Bir Adalet Feryadı was also a major intervention to Armenian historiography and the history of Istanbul Armenian community. And we are glad that in at least 3 Armenian community schools that we are aware of, it has been used as a source book in literature classes for permanent or temporary wall boards and for 8 March Women's Day celebration events, something definitely we can take credit for initiating. This is the school that I graduated from, and it was a surprise when I visited there in 2016. And these wall boards basically were prepared by the students using our book as a source. So Feminism in Armenian, the current project, extends this intervention to the overall field of Middle Eastern studies. It expands the scope of Bir Adalet Feryadı by including 7 more women and new selections from their body of work. It reflects the substantial new research we have conducted since 2006 in archives in Istanbul, Yerevan, Beirut, Paris, Vienna, and various libraries and collections in the US. The digital component of this project, that is the website, will provide open and free access to a database of published and unpublished works by and about these women, along with photographs, documents, and other memorabilia that shed light onto their lives. It will also contain oral history interviews we conducted with the descendants of these women. And it is bilingual. It can be navigated in both English and Armenian right now, but the material is obviously in Armenian, the archive. So if the purpose of the book is to make basics of Armenian feminist history available to the English reading public and bring Armenian women into visibility in the scholarly literature, the purpose of the website is to promote research on the history of Armenian feminism by providing original sources which are almost exclusively in Armenian. And another important goal of this database is to reach out to the non-academic world, mainly Armenian communities around the world, and provide material for the inclusion of Armenian feminist voices in education curricula. Women's emancipation struggle is a global movement that developed in relation to other movements, such as abolitionism, socialism, internationalism, nationalism, and decolonization. Feminism was not a marginalized issue in the formation of the modern Armenian subject, neither in the Ottoman context nor in Russian Empire, Iran, and Europe. As in the overall Ottoman modernization context or as elsewhere, gender politics was one of the definitive issues of Armenian modernity. Armenian feminists raised their critique of gender inequalities and challenged patriarchy within the context of Armenian intellectual awakening and national modernization. They demanded freedom and rights to education, employment, right to choose one's romantic partner, right to divorce, inclusion in the national decision-making processes, and so on. These women demanded these rights for women, while they also took active part in demanding freedom and rights for their own people, Armenians. They were inspired and made references to anti-slavery movement, just like the early feminists in Europe and America who were active in the abolitionist movement. They made references to socialism, anti-capitalism, internationalism, and anti-imperial nationalism. They used, negotiated, challenged, transformed, thus shaped the discourse and practice of Armenian nationalism. The women that we study were historical actors who responded to major historical events and processes, policies and social movements that transformed the Ottoman society and Ottoman Armenian society. So without further delay, let me turn to Mari Beyleryan and Zabel Yesayan. And I will give you a sense of their life trajectories. Mari Beyleryan was born and educated in Constantinople. She was born in Beşiktaş. Her career as writer began with articles she wrote for the local Armenian newspaper Arevelk, the East, while she was still a student. Before graduating, she also started working as a teacher, teaching religion and Armenian language and history. Beyleryan soon became the local correspondent of Hınçak, the publication of the Socialist Hınçakyan Revolutionary Party, writing her very first piece on the famous Kumkapı demonstration of July 27, 1890, which was organized by the party as its first public action to create awareness in the capital about the exploitation, dispossession, injustices, and violence experienced by the Armenians in the provinces, and to demand the implementation of reforms by the Ottoman government. During riots caused by the Ottoman soldiers blocking the advance of the protesters toward the Yıldız Palace, many protesters were wounded, killed, and arrested. Others found refuge outside the Ottoman territories. Among those arrested was one of Beyleryan's best friends, close comrades from the women's committee she had founded. Beyleryan went underground for a while. On September 30, 1895, a group of Armenian women from Muş and a supporting crowd led by Mari Beyleryan and her two women comrades entered the Patriarchate and demanded Patriarch Mateos Izmirlian's immediate action to hold meetings with the Ottoman government on behalf of Armenians. Protesters then marched to the Sublime Porte to demand reforms for the improvement of the conditions of Armenians and stop the massacres and to secure rights and justice. The demonstration was accompanied by bloodshed. Searched by the authorities, Beyleryan had to go into hiding again. This event is known as the Baba Ali demonstration in history, but Beyleryan's name doesn't show up in the existing historical narrative. We know these details mainly through Theodoros Laptınjian's account on her in his famous Everybody's Almanac, Ammenun Daretsuitsu. Eventually returning to Pera, one of the central districts of Constantinople, Beyleryan started teaching at the Esayan School. Meanwhile, she actively sought the support of European foreign missions to intervene and help her arrested and exiled comrades. In August 1896, when Armenian Revolutionary Federation revolutionaries took over the Ottoman Bank to attract the attention of European diplomats in Constantinople, Beyleryan was sentenced to death, escaped her besieged house, and spent the next couple of years in Cairo, Alexandria, and Cyprus, where she worked as a teacher and contributor to local periodicals. Between 1902 and 1903, she published the feminist journal Artemis in Cairo and in Alexandria. Her husband, Avo, was a great support and regular contributor. After this journal ceased publication, Beyleryan began writing for Azat Pem, Free Stage, another periodical of Alexandria and Cairo Armenians. Soon after the restoration of the Ottoman Constitution in 1908, Beyleryan moved back to the Ottoman Empire with the initial intention of working in Tokat, the northern Turkey, but accepting an offer by the Armenian community of Izmir on her way to Tokat, she stayed there and served as the principal of the Hripsimyants Girls' School. In 1914, she published Tebiver, upwards, a collection of her poetry and prose, some of which were the revised version of her Azat Pem articles. In her political writings and speeches addressed to her students, Mari Beyleryan advocated for an independent Armenian woman whose voice was heard both in the family and in the public. She devoted her pen and life to support the Armenian people's struggle for a better life. She theorized Armenian women's relationship to the nation and a genuine path for Armenian women's emancipation. Her short stories are manifestations of her personal outlook on the world she lived in. She narrated stories to challenge prejudiced moral conventions and to replace them with an understanding of ethics and justice. In 1915, she was the principal of an Armenian girls' school in Tokat. From there, she was deported with her students and colleagues and died under unknown circumstances. She is one of the Armenian intellectuals who fell victim to the genocide. We have very limited information of Mari Beyleryan's life. Few sources we have provide conflicting and confusing information, but I'm still researching and hopeful that I will find some more clarity very soon. The second woman I want to introduce is Zabel Yesayan, who was born as Zabel Hovannesyan in Üsküdar and attended the local Surpkaç Holy Cross Armenian school. She began her literary career with a series of free verse poems in Zagik, Flower Journal. She studied literature and philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris, where she also contributed to several French literary journals. While still in Paris, her novellas appeared in several Armenian periodicals in Istanbul, Izmir, Cairo, Tiflis, Tbilisi, and Baku. Between 1902 and 1905, she was back in Constantinople, where she taught at Armenian schools, became an active member of Armenian women's societies, and edited the women's section of the same journal, Zagik. Living in Paris for 3 years, Yesayan returned to Constantinople after the 1908 revolution, as many Armenian intellectuals did, but the promises of the revolution were belied by the massacres in Cilicia in April 1909. As a member of a delegation sent by the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople, Yesayan went to the massacre-torn region in order to document the violence and to provide humanitarian aid to the survivors. On her return to the capital, she published 2 articles: Voices from the Misery of the Orphans and from the Victims of the Catastrophe, The Raped Girl. Later in 1911, she collected her accounts and published them under the title Averaknerum Mech, Among the Ruins. And we've actually read some of these texts in my class. In April 1915, when the Armenian community leaders and intellectuals were arrested by the CUP government, Yesayan's name was on the list. Fortunately, when the police arrived at her home, she was not there. After hiding in Constantinople for a while, she found refuge in Bulgaria. And when Bulgaria entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, she fled to Caucasus, mainly to Tiflis. In 1917, she was in Baku, and there she published the eyewitness accounts she collected from the refugees surviving the genocide. By way of Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, she arrived in France in 1919. The same year, for the Armenian national delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, she prepared a report on the violence against non-Muslim women and children during the war. In 1920, she took on the responsibility of going back to Cilicia to take care of the orphans. When the French army withdrew from the region, Yesayan worked to transfer the orphans to a safer place. In June, with her 2 children, she moved to Beirut and then to Constantinople. She returned to Paris in 1921, shortly before her husband Tikran died. A new period began following Yesayan's visit to Moscow, Tiflis, and Soviet Armenia between 1926 and 1927. She published her travel notes and impressions of this trip. She celebrated women's conditions in the Soviet Union. She devoted herself to the work of strengthening the ties between Soviet Armenia and the Armenian community in France. In 1933, she permanently settled in Yerevan, became a member of the Soviet Writers' Union, and a lecturer of Western Armenian and French language and literature at Yerevan State University. In 1937, during the Stalinist purges, Yesayan was arrested and accused of anti-Soviet propaganda. She spent the last 5 years of her life in Yerevan, Leninagan, and Baku prisons. She died in 1942 or 43 under unknown circumstances. So unfortunately, because of time constraints, I won't talk about Yesayan's literary career as one of the most important novelists and short story writers of Armenian literature. But I highly recommend that you read her work. If you read Armenian, read it in Armenian. If you don't, read it in English. Some very influential works of her has been published by Armenian International Women's Association. So like some of them are out there available in English. And I will not focus on these 2 women's feminist thoughts or activism either, because this is not the subject of my talk today, but is a very rich discussion that we have been engaging ourselves with in our class this term with my students. But I think with these biographies I was able to give you a sense of who they are, who they were, their life trajectories, their intellectual and political stances. Besides, as you'll see in the discussion of their works, their perspectives on war, peace, justice, equality, freedom, rights, resistance, and self-defense are shaped by their feminisms and they constitute the definitive element of their feminist philosophy as Ottoman Armenian women. So now, about war and peace. Both Beylerian and Yesayan were against war. In the body of literature they left behind, they openly opposed militarism. In this opposition, they both addressed the question of peace and people's right to self-defense. They strongly condemn war. They consider women as the biggest victim of it. They attribute women the role of creating a peace culture. But they also take a critical stance vis-à-vis any definition of peace that fails to fulfill the conditions of freedom and justice. Beylerian argues that the reason why there is still bloodshed in the world today, that is then, in the beginning of the 20th century, and not that this is even before the World War I and the genocide, the only reason why there is still bloodshed in the world today, Beylerian says, is because governments violate people's rights and fail to bring justice to populations under their sovereignty. Because governments reject to do these peacefully, they leave no choice but fighting for rights and justice. The works by Beylerian and Yesayan that I focus on today are the ones that most clearly spell out their stance. These are the two articles by Yesayan, Khagagutyan Hamar, For Peace, in İzmir's Arevelian Mamul, Oriental Press, in 1906, 24 May. Gine Khagagutyan Hamar, Women for Peace, or For Peace Women, in New York-based Arakat, in 1911, June 8. And her fictional essay, Thinking Peace, Pavagane, Enough is Enough, originally published in Vienna's Arek, Sun, in 1922, and republished in Istanbul in 1925, 2 years after the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, in a collection of her previously published short stories and novellas. It is this edition that I will be referring to in this talk. I'd like to draw your attention to the specific dates these pieces were written. First one before the 1908 revolution, the restoration of the Ottoman Constitution, and before the 1909 Silesian massacres. The second one after those, but still before the genocide. And the third one after the genocide. This last piece, Pavagane, was published in 1922. But because it is about the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, it is also possible to think that Yesayan wrote or at least drafted this piece around that time. At least one of her biographers argues so, and this makes sense because the text itself gives that impression. But I'm reconsidering this and doing more research on this text and trying to understand the multi-layeredness of it. In fact, I read this almost totally forgotten text by Yesayan for the first time more than 10 years ago, and we included a translation of it in our Turkish volume. And I've actually written on this text in the past. But with this new project, Feminism in Armenian, and in the light of new sources and information, I'm revising my reading and my understanding of this multi-layered text, and we had a very productive discussion of it today in class, and Anna gave a very thought-provoking presentation on it. So my work with these texts are not done yet. So as for Mari Beylerian in this talk, I refer to two articles, namely Gnoch Astetutyuna Baderazma Yevginere, Women's Influence or Influence of Women, War and Women, and Gardikner Hay Hegapokutyan Vra, Thoughts on the Armenian Revolution. Both come from the 1914 collection. The second one is a version of a previously published article in Azadbem in 1906. These texts prove that both of these authors had a sharp analysis of the way war machine worked, killing the ordinary people who had no say in the decision-making processes, be it the ordinary soldiers or the attacked masses. In Women and War, Beylerian writes that power-seeking governments should leave aside their ambitions of ruling the world and instead focus on creating the conditions within which people will live in happiness and prosperity. For Beylerian, it is not acceptable to occupy someone else's homeland. It is not acceptable to torture and kill others. A victory based on raid, oppression, and injustice is a shameful one. Beylerian questions the pain caused by wars. She problematizes putting a man's destiny in another's hands when the two men have no reason to hate each other otherwise. Yesayan's Enough is Enough, as I said, is a fictional essay. It opens with a scene where the protagonist reflects on the news coming from the front. War has begun. She draws attention to the disturbing fact that while human lives are turning into corpses on the border, those who are far from the bloodshed are enjoying their warm homes in the capital with the luxury of forgetting about the fights and going on with their peaceful and undisturbed everyday lives. The idea of war and the idea of remaining untouched by it troubles her, the protagonist. With the call for mobilization, the war comes home. It reaches the capital, but every family tries to spare its own loved one and fails to grasp the massiveness or the totality of the war. Throughout the text, Yesayan expresses her dissent towards those who approve war for their interests, those who benefit from it. She comes up with a clear class analysis of militarism. She depicts a scene where the reserve soldiers are traveling on the ferry from the Asian side of Constantinople to the European side to be enlisted in the army. They are all peasants from the provinces, most probably seeing the city for the first time. They are mostly older in age and carry the marks of hard work on their bodies and faces. The protagonist thinks that these men are probably not even trained as soldiers and they will not be good at fighting. On this ferry ride, she overhears them talk about romanticism. She asks, is it possible that these men aren't aware of the fact that they will die soon? Their blood will warm the cold Balkan soil until it reaches saturation and revives with the lives it took. Then it will shout back at the whole world, enough is enough. In several points in the text, Yesayan repeats this outcry, enough is enough. A young man expresses his desire to see that the people misled on both sides and pushed to destruction cry out the same words, enough is enough. On the same ferry scene, Yesayan draws attention to the fact that military and government officers who ask poor people to sacrifice their lives are not the ones who are directly threatened by the horrors of the war. They know that no matter what happens, they will return to their warm homes. They are just disturbed by the scenery of the misery caused by the arrival of refugees from Romania. They would just prefer that they didn't have to see them. Both Yesayan and Beylerian believe that women are the major sufferers of war. Both of them mention rape as a common practice of sexual violence during wars and massacres targeting women and children. Especially Yesayan, who met the victims of rape in person, and Beylerian also mentions about the Armenian girls in Turkish harems. Besides, as Beylerian states, when a man dies, he leaves a mother, a sister, a wife, or a loved one behind in grief and her future shattered. It is women who suffer the most because they are the mothers who give birth to the soldiers and then have to send them to war, to death. Thus, for Beylerian, women have a major role to play in ending wars. They have the right to make their voices heard by the governments, in the parliaments, and the right to refuse to send their children to fight meaningless wars. Motherhood is an important standpoint and political position in Yesayan's peace activism as well. She was involved in a French women's peace organization, and in her For Peace article in 1906, she mentions that she was invited to a salon gathering at Polish-French writer, feminist and socialist Maria Szeliga's house. To this meeting of a Women's League for Peace through Education, women of different nations attended. Szeliga talked about role women could play in educating the masses and thus working towards preventing hatred and building peace. This is the same idea Yesayan advocates for in her later article, The Women for Peace, where she celebrates women's peace activism as mothers and educators as a definitive part of France's feminist movement, again referring to the same league and its international branches. Yesayan stresses that education plays a key role in peace activism, and it is women's, especially mothers, more than anybody else's responsibility to educate children at a young age against inherited enmities. Alliance universelle de femmes pour la paix et pour le désarmement, sorry my friend, pardon. So it's Universal Alliance of Women for Peace and Disarmament, was founded by Princess Gabrielle Vechnievska in 1896 in Paris. In the 1906 text, Yesayan mentions Sheliga, referring to Vechnievska as the founder of the organization. So this must be the same organization. Secondary sources indicate that the name of this organization changed to the Alliance Universelle des Femmes pour la Paix par l'Éducation in 1899, like Universal Alliance of Women for Peace through Education. Yesayan had been inspired by this alliance and wanted to start a solidarity league for Ottoman women across communities. From the letters she wrote to her husband in 1908, after the revolution, we can follow that she wanted to model it after the above-mentioned alliance, and in one of her letters, she asks Tikran to contact Sheliga and get a copy of their program. In Pavagane, actually, there is a scene that is most probably between two women that reminds me of Yesayan's discussion in this Women for Peace article. So in the scene, there are two women, an Armenian and Turkish, maybe Yesayan herself and her neighbor. Her Turkish neighbor, Yesayan identifies her as a Turk, asks the protagonist, probably Armenian, if not Yesayan, for some information about the war because the Turkish newspapers misinform their readers. She asks probably because she thinks that she's able to follow, like Yesayan or the Armenian woman, is probably more able to follow the news from Armenian or foreign language press. So she's asking like if the Ottomans are defeated or not. The protagonist communicates the bad news with her, that is the defeat and the retreat of the Ottoman army. In this scene, Turks are portrayed as deceived by their government, which demands their blood and sends them to the unknown. When this woman begins crying, the protagonist feels that the inherited hatred or inherited enmity, the same wording that she used in the peace article, melts down and she begins soothing her. As I said before, Beylerian and Yesayan were convinced that women were by nature or by birth against war. Yesayan states that because women take on the heavy responsibility of protecting and sustaining the family, no matter which race or class they belong to, by nature they are on the side of peace. They are already against cruelty and they will never be seduced by the glory of power like men do. Here, Yesayan differentiates between offensive and defensive war. She asserts that throughout history, women took active roles only in wars that had a self-defense purpose. İnkna başpanutun. Beylerian's Women and War, on the other hand, is a call for Armenian women to join the fight for Armenian people's defense of their homeland. She argues that the only reason why war still exists and shedding blood is still accepted is because there are nations and people who do not feel remorse for attacking other people and nations, looting and confiscating their land for their interests. That's why, according to Beylerian, defending one's own land is a just and legitimate fight. It is also a right, and when this right is violated, women too have the duty to join the war. In fact, Beylerian attributes Armenian women the very responsibility of securing the existence of their people. With their mental, affective, and bodily labor, women have to resist against annihilation of the Armenian people. Beylerian also talks about women as fighters. She maintains that throughout history, women not only inspired, motivated, encouraged, and appreciated men who defended their homelands, but they themselves, despite their weak and timid-looking natures, proved to have the capacity and power to become heroes. To provide examples, Beylerian refers to the near and distant past, to Armenian and non-Armenian women. She brings up the 5th, 11th, and 14th century Armenian women who fought on the battlefields and tended the wounded in battles. Armenian fought against their overlords who attacked their faith, or invaders who tried to capture their cities, or women who killed themselves and their children not to be captured, not to be raped, or not to be converted. It was not an uncommon practice among the 19th and 20th century Armenian feminists to reference names from the past as models of strong, influential Armenian women. These women were making a history of their own, if you like. But here, Beylerian takes one step further by providing a genealogy of women from the Old and the New Testament Jewish, Greek, and Roman history, Italian, French, and Russian revolutions, as well as Armenian history, to prove that women have always been fighters and revolutionaries. The mythical dimension of this is obvious, but the very fact that she also praises women who were active in the recent Armenian resistances, peasant resistances, and those Armenian women, revolutionaries, who were arrested and tortured in the capital also serves another purpose. As much as it is a call to encourage Armenian women to join the fight, it is also a historiographic intervention that writes women into the history of Armenian revolutionary movement. It is not hard to assume that some of these arrested and tortured women were her friends, whose names we barely know today. Ironically, she herself was soon going to be forgotten in the same historiography. For Beylerian, the world peace, harmony, equality, freedom, including freedom of thought, freedom of press, love and fraternity of people are ultimate goals. They are the most desired and dreamed of about ideals. For Yesayan as well, peace is a universal and irresistible ideal. But as Beylerian, Yesayan too is very realistic about her definition of peace. Peace requires that many political and social injustices will be corrected and communities and races will be able to practice their rights in full. In her Thoughts on the Armenian Revolution article, Beylerian specifically talks about the revolution. She says that the main motive behind people's and nations' revolutions is to fight the yoke of ignorant, intolerant and oppressive governments they fell subject to. Beylerian argues that Armenians fought the revolutionary fight but were defeated, unlike the other nations with whom they shared a common fate, referring to the Balkan nations and Crete. But she argues that it is the violence and oppression that Armenian people in Ottoman Armenia endured created Armenian revolution rather than revolutionaries themselves, meaning it was a genuine response of the people to their dire conditions. She talks about assaults on honor and faith, rape and abduction of Armenian women, forced conversions, murders, dispossession of Armenians from their properties and animals, thus from their livelihood. But all these immediate life-threatening conditions at the same time prevented Armenians from revolting and expecting European intervention. Beylerian is very critical of the European governments who turn Armenian suffering into a matter of negotiation with the Ottoman government for their own interests. But solidarity with the people in Europe rather than the governments is meaningful because the people can pressure their governments to take measures for the emancipation, liberation of all oppressed races. It is only with the people one can build solidarity in such a cause, because masses, having suffered and still suffering themselves, understand the misery and the agony of the Armenian people. Beylerian refers to Armenian American suffragist Alice Stone Blackwell, a defender of Armenian rights, as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of Armenians. In both of her articles, Beylerian mentions Harriet Beecher Stowe, the American abolitionist author, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was translated into Armenian in 1854, 2 years after the original translation in English. Beylerian believes that rather than waiting for foreign governments' interventions, people have to fight their own fight. Yes, Armenians were massacred, but every nation who fights for an honorable life will face persecution. She brings the example of revolutionaries in Russia and the Caucasus facing violence while fighting against the oppressive regime. Armenians in the Ottoman Armenia live in the ruins of their orphaned homeland and side by side with their destroyed homes and the corpses of their loved ones. Armenians who live outside this reality cannot understand the feeling of vengeance tormenting the hearts of these people. That's why Beylerian criticizes those who disapprove Armenian revolutionaries' actions to organize self-defense fights, İkna Başpanutyan Griv. For Beylerian, it is this fight, the self-defense fight, that determines the fate of enslaved nations, and freedom is a vital and sacred right. Thus, being a revolutionary is also a matter of having good ethics. There is a thought-provoking intertextuality between Yesayan's and Beylerian's texts at this point. In Enough is Enough, Yesayan presents a scene where the protagonist is critical of those who discuss the right to fight, That is, if the Balkan Wars is a fight for justice for the exploited, murdered, dishonored, and enslaved Balkan people against their centuries-old oppressor, the Ottoman Empire, the Turk, or do the Turks have the right to defend themselves? Through the voice of an elderly man, Yesayan shares the view that this is a fair punishment for the sufferings that they caused. That is, it is the curse of grieving mothers and orphans, and it might very well be time of justice. But the protagonist criticizes the conversations that revolve around European intervention and diplomacy, and says that thousands of villagers from both sides are dying now. Thus, she refuses to hear any explanations or excuses that present the war as a desirable or even inevitable thing. In this scene, there is a young man, probably an Armenian, who asks if the ones who attacked, killed, and dishonored us didn't deserve this lesson. His eyes are full of vengeance. The protagonist sees him as a sick soul who needs care. This man is a witness of the massacres, and the protagonist is a stranger to her people's fate. For her, that big of a violence is only an unimaginable nightmare that is impossible to grasp in totality. So it strikes me that this scene reminds Beylerian's discussions I just explained. That is, your failure of understanding the feeling of vengeance is due to your unawareness or your distance from people's pains. Yesayan's Enough is Enough presents two voices. One of them constantly reminds us that evil actions shouldn't be forgotten, but the other strongly opposes the idea that only war can bring justice. Yesayan's portrayal of the caravans of refugees from the Balkans, women, children, and the elderly, with lost hopes and a homeland left behind, reminds the reader of Armenian refugees. She depicts a scene where the protagonist, and I still read this protagonist as an Armenian woman, even if this is not a directly biographic essay. Yesayan's protagonist uses the first person singular I. So this text is a thinking piece, an inner dialogue, a rather unresolved flow of thoughts with very strong analysis and statements and clear references to actual historic events. So the I, either Yesayan or this Armenian woman, watches the refugees and reflects on the commonalities between herself and these oppressed and fugitive people she feels a strong identification with. And I think this is where she comes closest to speaking from the voice of an Armenian woman who witnessed violence. The fear on these refugees' faces stirs the barely suited deep pain in her. She painfully remembers the events of another land, another Yergir, and its survivors lying in front of her eyes. In either cases, that is whether Enough is Enough was written after she came back from Cilicia in 1921, or between her time in the massacre-torn Cilicia in 1909 and her time in Caucasus and the Middle East with the genocide survivors, when evaluated in the light of Yesayan's testimonial writings and her commitment to document and heal the wounds of the people, the violence befell her people, this text opens up an important discussion. It is not possible to say that Yesayan was not aware of or was not vocal about the role masses, the ordinary people, played in the violence against Armenians, both in the massacres of 1909 or during the genocide. But she still defends this ideal, rather critically, that it is the people who will understand each other and build peace. This text obviously is a response to the violence Armenians endured. It is written from the perspective of someone who witnessed the destruction and is in search of a path that will end it. But she also seeks recognition and justice. She is very realistic about her call for peace. By juxtaposing a woman's discontent with all the other voices, all presented as male voices in this text, Enough is Enough manifests an ideal. If and only if those enemy sides know that how similar their appearance and expressions, their outcries and curses under conditions of misery are, maybe then the otherwise impossible ideals of harmony and fraternity will become a possibility. This is a wish, a call, a manifesto that expresses a potentiality with an awareness of the conditions of impossibility. Enough is Enough ends on a pacifist stance through the inner conversation of the protagonist with her ancestors, the Armenian people, whose voices are peaceful, bright, and forgiving. The protagonist unleashes herself from the chains of resentment that is captivating and damaging, but also holds on to an important truth, the truth of past and present injustices. To conclude my words, I want to rewind back and focus on a very important earlier scene in the text. In a moment of reflection, sitting by her baby's cradle, the protagonist repeats the words of the young man whom she considered troubled by the feeling of revenge in the previous section. She reminds herself and the reader that the enemy violently attacked houses where candles were burning peacefully by cradles. They committed crimes by murdering people, by assaulting everything powerful, beautiful, and sacred. She establishes the truth. It's true that the enemy is vulgar and evil. As an Armenian, her baby reminds her of the inherited sufferings of her people and the insecurities of the future. Seated by the cradle, looking at her baby's exhausted eyes, she feels that she collapses under the oppression of ages-long slavery. As a mother, her wish would be to watch her baby live with pride and joy, and create him, probably him in the sense, the son, a beautiful dream of the future. But the feelings of fear, anxiety, and dread disturb her motherly heart. She wants to sing and rock the baby, but all the songs are frozen on her lips. She would do everything to seize all the storms, smoothen all the roads for her child. She would sow the seeds of love and peace in his heart, but instead she has to invite him to struggle, to fight, to baikar, so that she or he won't bow like a slave. Holding the baby's hand, she has to direct its steps to the path of the idea that caused many mothers wait in vain for their son's victorious return, and that often became the journey from which martyrs never came back. So I'd like to end my discussion of this text here. My purpose today was to show that these women, as Ottoman and Armenian intellectuals, actively taught and wrote about war, peace, militarism, self-defense, resistance, and justice in the context of Armenian experience at the turn of the 20th century in the Ottoman Empire. They left behind a body of political philosophy literature that waits to be put in dialogue with the 19th and 20th centuries global, especially Marxist literature on imperialism, colonialism, violence, and resistance. I hope that I was able to give you a brief insight about the ways in which the study of the history of Armenian feminism contributes and makes interventions to our understanding of the global history of feminism and world history studies in general. Thank you. Okay, I hope this was not too boring because I had to read it. Like there was no way I could remember all the, references and stuff. So if you have any questions about the project, about Mari and Zabel. Yes.
I will ask something. Mary Balerian, she got married and she wrote the first book is Tragedy. That's what it said in Armenian as I was reading. Did she ever mention about
Mari Balerian?
Yeah, that's what when you put down at the beginning the Armenian verse, the text.
You mean
about her biography? She says she got married to somebody who was quite older, and the first thing she wrote was Vohpe Kuchun. That's what you put down. Anyway,
no.
Okay. So I was just wondering if she ever wrote about.
Mari's husband was a revolutionary, Avo Nakashian or Nakashtian, and I have the sense that they were a very camaraderie couple, because when Mari came up with this idea of publishing a feminist journal in Egypt, this is actually, we were talking about this in class, the biographer Teotik writes it in almost like an adventure. Mari sent the husband to Echmiadzin to meet Magaric Khrimian, and Magaric Khrimian supports this journal and gives a copy of his unpublished manuscript so that Avo can bring it back to Cairo and they publish it and use the revenue, use the money to print the journal. I'm not sure Vohper could. Mari's book is Tebiver, and I don't know what.
Read the text. Anyway, I was
Oh,
wondering
it's
if
Anais. Sorry.
Anais,
It's
that's right.
Anais. I'm like, it's in the.
Anais, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
here. How were you able to read that?
Yeah,
Okay. No, no. Yes, yes, yes. Let's go there. Yes, yes.
you're right.
Anais had a terrible marriage. We can say that. You're right.
Okay. So I was wondering, have
Anais,
they ever read
yes.
about
Yes, Anais.
violence in their marriages?
Anais. Violence in their marriages, no. But like this is really in between the lines in her memoir. We get the impression that she was not happy in her marriage. But no, you're very right. Like violence, these women never wrote anything about like violence going on in their marriages. But she wrote, yes, a poem. And we translated it into, our translator, Shoshana Vagyan, translated it into English, and it will be in the book. Thanks for bringing that up, because it's called The Wedding, and it's actually a funeral, depiction of a funeral. So, yes, that's a poem that we translated. But this doesn't mean that there was not, like, domestic violence in the Armenian community. There was, because, like, Haygana Shmark actually was very vocal about it, and there is even a case where she takes a young woman to where is Hayganush? Yes, Hayganush. So it's in Haygin, and Lerna's actually book and dissertation is on Haygin, on Hayganush Mark. Hayganush Mark advocated for women's right to get a divorce. And she actually brings a case of like domestic violence. And actually, like divorce was a very important part of their activism. And in like even Dusab here, Dusab's Siranush, the second novel, she wrote 3 novels. The second novel has like a very important discussion on like divorce, like women's rights to get a divorce. Okay. Yes.
I have a question. Thank you for this lecture. I really enjoyed it. It seems, I mean, these women are from the same generation, the same time.
More or less. Actually, there are different generations. It's from 1860s to 1960s. Their time of like being active is.
From what I've seen.
Yeah.
Did they meet or were they in correspondence?
Yes.
Did they write to each other? Did they
Yes.
share views?
So actually, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. The reason why we focus on these 12 women, obviously, like a couple of things. Like obviously, Armenian feminism was not only active only in the Ottoman Empire. There were like Russian Armenian and Armenian women in Iran who were like feminists, and they had organizations and wrote about women's emancipation. So that's one thing. The other thing is, obviously, these are the women who were privileged enough to receive education and to be able to write and become writers. So there were a lot of like activist women who didn't leave anything behind, or we will find them in the archives one day. And also musicians, teachers, principals, like, I mean, it's like more populated, obviously. But there is a genealogy here. That's why initially we had 5 and then now we have 12. Because by reading one of them, you actually like come across the other's name, and then like you realize that like in their memoirs they mention their best friends. There were 2 very important Armenian women's societies in the Ottoman Constantinople forms. 1879. Both of them were founded in the same year by coincidence. One was founded by Zabel Asadur when she was 17, by the help of her mother and aunt. The other by Dusab's mother. Dusab was part of the organization, and then she chaired. Tebrotaser Hayuhyatsun Gerutyun. Tebrotaser later became Tebrotaser Dignant, which the purpose was to start a girls' teachers' school, to train Armenian girls to become teachers, to serve, and that was the condition of their scholarship, to go to the provinces and work there as teachers in Armenian girls' schools. The other organization, Askanver Hayuhyatsun Gerutyun, Patriotic Armenian Women's Society, founded by Asadur, again the same year. The purpose was creating a network of education throughout the Ottoman provinces for Armenian girls. So initially these two organizations worked very closely because one was training teachers and also like bringing girls from the provinces, and like these were boarding schools, and also sending teachers and paying their salaries in the schools that Askanaver opened. So later, I mean, it's very complicated. Later, like Dusap died. Asadur is a different story. She stayed in Turkey, but she was a little afraid after the genocide. But like chairs change, politics change, like different things happen. But these women mainly know each other from these organizations. They worked very closely. So interesting connections like Gesaratsyan, almost completely forgotten name, even in the writings of Armenian women of her time. She actually, when she published her book, she donated donated the book to the Askanaver, because the book was published in 1879, and the Askanaver was opened in 1879, and then she actually donated the money, the revenue of the book, to the association. So that's one connection. Basically, another connection, Zabel Yesayan in her memoirs, she devotes a chapter to Maida, to Dusab, says like, when I was growing up with actually another one, Arshagui and Yesayan grew up together. And there's a scene in Yesayan's memoir where Arshagui and Zabel go read Maida. They try to, that's why I'm saying there are different generations, because like they are younger then. They're reading Dusab's novels. They're like, questioning their own, the oppression and everything. And then they actually go and pay a visit to Dusab. And Yesayan says like, I want to become a writer. And Dusab says like, you have to receive higher education. You can't afford being mediocre. You have to be a good writer, because if when a man writes like, creates bad literature, he's a writer. But when a woman produces bad, it's not. So like all these things. Then I can go on, like the connections, like they were teachers of each other. And obviously what I want to like end the answer with is like, there's a genealogy. The reason why we included Seza is because she's also the last person in that genealogy. It's like all these women were somehow connected to each other. And Teotik and Arshagui and Zabel Asadur worked together in Askanaver Hayatın Gerutyun. And actually they wrote about, and the important thing is all these women had a very important, and Seza included, because this is how we were able to find Seza. They all wrote about this genealogy. They said before me there was Dusab, before me there was Askanaver. Even when they were critical, even when they wanted to say things, not against, but from their own perspective. Even in their memoirs, they mentioned each other. So some of them didn't get along well. I mean, I know that Yesayan and Asadur didn't like each other. So, but still, they had this consciousness, this awareness that maybe they had this awareness that nobody will write this history if we don't, or they believed in solidarity and they believed in the power of what they were doing together. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, just
Yeah. And there is another. Sorry.
How long did it take you to do this research?
20 years. I wish it was. I can actually show it. Maybe I won't be able to find it. So, in 1998, we started a group of Armenian feminist college students, and we started researching. And we were very lucky because initially our intention, or we had really no idea. We went to Armenian community schools. Our Armenian literature textbook co-author was Zabel Asadur. But we had no idea that she even uttered the word feminism and defended feminists. So we had no idea. We had never heard about Dusab, anybody. So we were this was in the 1990s, we were on campus, we were getting organized on campus, becoming feminist, meeting Turkish and Kurdish feminists, and like, especially with the Kurdish feminists criticism, we came up with this idea of like, there must be an Armenian feminist of like in Turkey, kind of like as minority women, like we have to have our own vocabulary, have our own feminist kind of demands or perspective. So we decided to put together an event at one of our Armenian community centers, and these were like feminist plays, you know, like party, all kinds of things, more like feminist contact. We had a manifesto in Armenian and Turkish, probably a little too radical for the Armenian community, about like sexual freedom and everything. And, you know, I don't know, like it was well received actually. I don't think, you know, it was well received to the extent that one leg of that event was actually we put together an exhibition of Armenian women past and present, and we even only had photographs or like the book covers of only the sub maybe. So what we did was it was actually through the elderly members of our community. They said like, and actually two men basically who are very knowledgeable. Actually, Yervant Gobelian personally knew Seza, and it is through him that we know about Seza. They brought and they gave us the books. They said like, girls, you say that you're feminists. We had Armenian feminists in the past. You have to read them. And actually, it all started with us reading Haygan Ishmark, not making sense of anything, because for us in the beginning, she was not a feminist. But then gradually, like, understanding the context and everything. And the second year, we put together a lecture, and then gradually, like, we started, you know, like, it became an academic thing. Armen, sorry.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
I just had a quick question. Do you know how how this anti-war literature was received at the time, particularly like in Armenian circles?
Very interesting. That is the kind of research I want to do. I have to, yes. I mean, one thing is, so this project, this like war, peace, anti-militarism, resistance, justice discussion has a lot of room to unfold. I mean, this is just the beginning, really. I've been thinking about this. I mean, my reading of this text is very much informed by my readings of like other texts, like post-colonial literature, Frantz Fanon, or like Lenin, or, you know, like everything. But I, like with this project that I started focusing on, like putting everything together. And it really has like, this is basically almost like, I wanted to present this because I wanted to present something new, because I've already presented POWs and like this project before. That, and also like in class, like we have been discussing these issues, and I wanted to really open up to discussion. But there is research to be done, and one of them is really basically most important thing is to put them in dialogue with the revolutionary literature of like Armenian revolutionary parties, like programs and you know, basically their periodicals and the articles that were published there, and like where how these women situated themselves in relation to that discourse. Yeah.
So a number of the women you mentioned spent time in the Caucasus, in Tbilisi and Baku, and it's obviously such a revolutionary popular. I'm just kind of interested in both in what their experiences there, both before and in some instances after the war. You know, I mean, did any of them end up at the College of the Peoples of the East or any of that kind of stuff?
Actually, like I want to say that it's only Zabel Yesayan who was in the Caucasus. So Mari Beylarian's Artemis was definitely funded and read because Mari was not allowed to come back to the center technically there, like Cairo and Alexandria have this really weird relationship in the Hamidian period with the center, right? Like it's more like safe, and they can write and do things. But she, but like there is evidence that like it is possible to say that maybe Artemis was also read in the Ottoman Empire, but the main audience was the Caucasus. We know that, but her husband went to Echmiadzin. I don't know if she was ever was there. I don't think she was ever in the Caucasus. The only person, I don't want to make a mistake here, but yes. So yeah, the only person actually who was in the Caucasus, who has been to Caucasus, is Zabel, and it is right after the genocide, because she is in Bulgaria. Bulgaria enters the war, and then by way of like from the north, they arrive in Tiflis, because like the families of many Armenian intellectuals who were arrested actually are there then, and she does some like relief work and like testimony collecting with the survivors. It is very interesting. I don't really have anything from that era, like 1915 to let's say 1919, because and then she moved to Iran, Iraq, and then like from Egypt. I don't have anything from that, but there are works where she openly writes about her, actually like Prometheus Azakirvas, Prometheus Unchained, is her travel notes, her impressions of her travel to Soviet Union in 1926, 1927. That's later. So, but she writes, she has a section, and we are translating into English, on Lenin. She has a section on her trip to the kolkhozes, and like, you know, all sorts of like Soviet women's, you know, what is it? The main person who is like in charge of women's. She has a meeting with, yeah, she has a meeting with her, and then basically she writes about Tiflis, because she has been to Tiflis, Moscow, and then she goes to Yerevan. That's actually, to my knowledge, that's actually all we have about Caucasus from Yesayan.
Maybe I misheard that one of these women had spent time in Baku.
It's Yesayan. Yesayan. Yesayan was in Baku in 1917. She was in Baku because in Baku, obviously, like there was Armenian community quite strong, and actually, like she published the eyewitness testimonies in Baku. So that's yeah, she was in Baku. I'm thinking like I don't think anybody else here was in the Caucasus. So that's a good question. I mean, that doesn't mean that they were not influenced. I mean, one important thing is like there was a lot of like correspondence between women in the Caucasus. Like we also have in the book letters between Shushanik Gurginian, who was a revolutionary, like Armenian women in like Russian Armenian women, between Arshakui Teotik and Shushanik Gurginian, and they were like informing each other about like Armenian women's activities. In actually, it's Teotik who is writing about like we have these writers in Istanbul and informing each other, and they were in touch with each other. Yes, this is actually this
aspects of that.
Yeah.
What interests me really is actually the post-war aspect, the Soviet.
Yeah. But actually, you're also another connection is, yes, Marive Ilarian in the text in my talk, I talked about how she's actually like referring to specific like Russian revolutionaries and as role models, as like women who are revolutionaries and we can be like them. So it's very, I mean, because she was Hunchak. I mean, she was reading, and she basically was in touch with you know. If she was not in touch, she was reading like what was going on, what Russian revolutionaries were doing around that time. So she brought this information into and she approved them. She kind of like used them as role models. Yeah. But that is also, so like I feel like this book and Digital Archive project will for another 10 years. Like, because even when I was writing this last night, I'm like, Lerna, like, I didn't sleep yet. Lerna is like, what's going on? I'm like, in this text, like in this line and here, like there is something that I just caught, and like I'm like, oh my God, like we really like have to do like, it's a very good thing, because also like, I mean, we are obviously very ambitious about this project, but we are not ambitious about like writing everything and finding everything and doing everything about all these women. The purpose really is, and we're very like sincere about this, is that like we published a book in Turkish, which was based on our undergraduate research. Like now it's time. We want to like show the world that there were more women, and it's not only us. Like there were, in the meantime, there were like some dissertations written, and some other women were like made visible. But like we really want the world, English reading, like readership, to know about these women and get inspired and maybe learn Armenian and use these archives or like other archives and write something. Write the things that we won't be able to write in our lifetime, basically. Because I have my own book, this is also my own book, like my other book to write. But obviously, like this is my and Lerna's obviously like life project. It's like our baby, and like it excites us. Last night when I was reading the things that I've written in the past and I caught mistakes, I was both happy that now I know more, but I was also really frustrated because it's almost like my baby, yes. Because any information you threw out to the universe, somebody hopefully will catch it, and So anyway, I'll stop here. Yes,
kind of going from what you're saying, is it possible, in your opinion, to create some sort of, not a book, but something that would be geared towards like the 14-year-old, not girls?
No. Yeah, that's the project.
To be able to put it into an American or any curriculum.
That's actually the.
They wouldn't be able to understand the level that you have now, but to lower it down. Is that something that you would work on, or somebody else could work on? Or,
ideally, I know. So
could the work could be made simple to be able to put it into a curriculum one day?
Thank you very much for that question. That is definitely part of this project. And one of the reasons why we are doing the digital archive is like obviously scholarly purposes, but also like a couple of weeks ago in April, we had a workshop with like Armenian, bringing feminist studies and Armenian studies together. So we had a workshop with Armenian women scholars, and we discussed about the possibilities of like how to extend this website into something more accessible to people who don't read Armenian or who read Armenian but are in schools and want to use it with high school kids or like middle school kids. So that is there. The idea is there, and we really want, and we saw that in high schools, if our book is now in Turkey, in the Armenian high school that we graduated from, who can read and write in Armenian, but still they are using it in Turkish, and it's kind of like we're a little critical of that, but still, because they are inspired, like there's something it makes an intervention. This is like feminism. So the thing is, we have a lot of ideas. We presented our work to the Sunday school kids in Watertown. They were very creative. They said that we should like create Instagram accounts and stuff, use like technology more. One dream is, two dreams that I have, I won't be able to do. Maybe one I can. Like I've always wanted to write children's storybooks. That was my dream. I always wanted to do that. I don't know if I will be able to write the children's storybooks for these women, but definitely I want to collaborate. We want to collaborate with women who will be able to do that, or men who will be able to do that. The thing is, yes, not only girls but boys. So like the Sunday school basically like was a co-ed school, and we had a lot of feedback, and obviously the idea is not just like to educate girls, to educate boys and girls against patriarchy and sexism and everything in the community. There are some ideas, like we want to create audiobooks in Armenian and upload them online. We want to create like children's storybooks. We want to do something else. We want animations. We want to do animations. We actually, like, I was in touch with an animation artist, Armenian, and she's doing like children's stuff. And we want, and actually, like, I've been you asked the question. I've been collecting like children's storybooks, like feminist, African American history, like history of slavery, history of like native, people, native history. So all kinds of like, how can I put, like historical consciousness kind of, but not didactic, but like stories. So I really want to do like these women in like these kind of like series of books with these women. Also, like there is this wonderful series like, what is it, Little People, Big Dreams? Like Frida Kahlo and, like Marie Curie and all this. So like, why Zabel Sayan? Why not Zabel Sayan? Or like, I have a book about Rosa Parks. I have like, so like, or issues like school segregation. I have a book by Toni Morrison about like school segregation and writing it from children's perspective, really. Not to traumatize them, but like to teach that children, so like something like this. Yeah, a lot of, like we want to use technology, but we need a team and we want to work with artists. We have some artist friends who already want to collaborate with us. We also want to, this is my dream and also Lerna's. We want the digital archive have a music component because some of these women were poets and very like influential poets, and their poetry were set to music, and some of them are still very popularly sung in the Armenian communities. And I have for some of this music, I have actually the sheet music. I have the scores. So like I want to like, I know like some, anyway, like this is a surprise. Some very important, like singer in the Armenian, community already agreed that she will be able to sing it. So, but we don't know, like this is in the future. But thanks for bringing it. Sorry, I think last question we have.
I just want to say thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you.
I'm Tamar Vasoyan. I had very short encounter with Melosa years ago. And when I was doing my dissertation about Armenian women, and the Floda encounter set me on a way that I couldn't imagine. I did not have any idea about all this when I started. You opened my eyes. Why I really, really value your work is because since the genocide, we lost our memory as Armenians, especially memory of Armenian accomplished women. And that's our, my responsibility is to reclaim that legacy for the future generations. So I see it very, very important.
Thank you.
For Armenian people, it's really important because that's all our identity. All these women accomplished all this, and we have no clue about it.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much. So I'm really tired.